Imagine being ripped from your family, forced to endure unimaginable horrors, and sold into bondage. This was a brutal reality for millions of Nigerians during the transatlantic slave trade. For centuries, the slave trade ravaged Nigerian societies, leaving deep scars that still linger today. But despite its profound impact, this dark chapter in Nigerian history remains shrouded in mystery. In this video, we'll delve into the untold stories of the transatlantic slave trade in Nigeria, and we'll explore the complex web of factors that fueled this brutal system. Get ready to uncover the hidden truths of Nigeria's darkest past. Get ready to confront the brutal realities of the slave trade, and get ready to be inspired by the resilience and determination of the Nigerian people. Welcome to Nigeria, a land of incredible diversity and rich cultural heritage. But Nigeria's history is also marked by a painful and devastating chapter. Between the 15th and 19th centuries, millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homes and sold into slavery in the Americas. Nigeria was one of the main sources of enslaved Africans, with many of its ethnic groups and kingdoms being ravaged by the slave trade. Before the arrival of Europeans, Nigeria was home to a diverse array of kingdoms, empires, and city-states. These pre-colonial societies had complex systems of governance, economy, and culture. But before the arrival of European influence, traditional slave trade was a key part of the Nigerian society, and it continued locally long after the effective abolition of slavery in many other countries. In the southeast, the Igbo people had a decentralized system of governance, with decision-making power resting in the hands of local leaders and council. The Igbo traditionally maintained the Osu caste system of the Ordinary religion. Osu were people who were regarded as spiritually inferior, and they were segregated from regular Igbo society. Osu were either kept as slaves or sold into the slave trade. In the north, the Hausa city-states were major players in the trans-Saharan trade network. They traded goods such as cloth, leather, and spices, but also enslaved people. In the southwest, the Yoruba kingdoms were major powers in this region. They had a complex system of governance, with the Ooni of Ife serving as the spiritual leader of the Yoruba people. Slavery had traditionally existed among the Yoruba people. Owning slaves was a status symbol in Yoruba society. A Yoruba person who owned slaves displayed signs of being a wealthy and influential person. Slaves typically worked for powerful elites of Yoruba society, and they were tasked with farm cultivation and other personal purposes. But with contact with Muslims and Europeans, the story changed as the popularity of slavery increased and slave trade was seen as a profitable source of income. The transatlantic slave trade began in the late 15th century in Nigeria. By 1471, Portuguese navigators, hoping to tap into the famous Saharan gold trade, explored the West African coast as far as the Niger Delta and traded European commodities for local crafts as well as slaves, which later turned out to be highly lucrative. In the early stages, Europeans captured Nigerians in raids on coastal communities, but as the demand grew, they relied on slaves to be supplied by local rulers in exchange for rum, guns, horses, industrial products, and fine clothes. By 1490, more than 3,000 slaves a year were transported to Portugal and Spain. With the European expansion and colonization of the West Indies and America, what was a small market in ivory, gold, and slaves transformed into a massive global trade. From the 16th century to the early 19th centuries, Portuguese, Dutch, French, and English merchants greedily expanded the African slave trade internationally. Enormous profits were made mostly by Europeans, but a small number of Africans also benefited economically, mostly along the southwestern coast of Nigeria. Over this period of trade, more than 3.5 million slaves were shipped from Nigeria to North and South America and the Caribbean colonies. The slave trade degraded pre-existing social, political, and religious structures and destroyed long-standing trading patterns, turning markets along the trans-Saharan trade routes into slave stations. Competition among local tribes in the slave trade was intense and spurred internal wars to provide a steady flow of slave captives.
And these are the things that they are using for the slaves, not the olden days. And they use this one for the legs. They'll padlock it there, another person will put his own. That's how they put it on the line. They step on each line. And they started whipping them with horsewhip, one by one. They must go one.
The Middle Passage was the notorious route taken by enslaved Africans, including Nigerians, across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. This brutal journey lasted for centuries, resulting in the deaths of millions of people. Enslaved Nigerians were forcibly taken from their homes and communities, often with the help of local leaders and European traders. They were then marched to the coast, where they were loaded onto ships bounded for the Americas. The conditions on the slave ships were brutal and inhumane. Enslaved people were packed tightly into cramped spaces with little food, water, or air. Many died during this journey, their bodies thrown overboard to the sharks. Enslaved Nigerians in the Americas faced a life of hard labor, physical punishment, and emotional traumas. Many resisted their enslavement using various forms of resistance, including rebellions, escapes, and cultural retention. The Middle Passage has left a lasting legacy, shaping the modern world and continuing to impact the lives of the people of African descent. The transatlantic slave trade had a profound impact on Nigerian societies, affecting every aspect of life, from economy and politics to culture and identity. The local societies that were implicated in supplying the most slaves also experienced internal crisis and struggle. The Yoruba city-states ended up engaged in internal wars for the control of the slave trade. In the north, the Islamic legal prohibition against enslaving Muslims led to rising conversion to Islam in order to avoid enslavement, though the economic incentives ensured that many Muslims were taken by Muslim raiders and predatory neighboring societies. By the time slavery was abolished in the early 19th century and replaced by a lucrative palm oil trade, northern Nigeria had become a highly militarized society, and the west and other coastal cities in the South Delta region had risen as important economic hub, with long-standing European contacts, setting the stage for intensified polarization that will take place in the coming years. Throughout Nigeria, traditional leadership structures had been shuffled and in some cases dismantled, leading to vulnerabilities and violence that left the country ripe for colonization. In 1807, the British outlawed the slave trade, a decision that was both cultural and economic in nature. The growth of evangelical Protestantism against the Catholic Church lent a critical voice to discussions of slavery. Missionaries understood that converting slaves to Christianity was not in harmony with slave treatment. Enslaved Nigerians, often with the help of local leaders and communities, launched armed attacks against slave traders, colonial powers, and slave-holding societies. Nigerians also used cultural resistance to challenge their enslavement. They retained their languages, customs, and traditions, even in the face of brutal suppression. The second cause for abolition was the rise of the Industrial Revolution and the decline in plantation economies. Slaves were both industrial laborers as well as poor customers for British products. The British pushed the concept of legitimate commerce as a replacement for slavery, particularly the production of palm oil, which was sought after in Europe. However, palm oil production encouraged domestic slavery to provide labor for palm plantations and transport palm oil from interior to merchants in the coast. And slaves were still sent on ships leaving from cities along the coast. The British began policing the coast, intercepting slave ships and releasing their prisoners. Among these released slaves included young Samuel Ajayi Crowther, who was raised in a missionary school and went on to become the first African Anglican bishop, serving as an abolitionist and played a key role in the fight against slavery. Ending the slave trade and developing alternative markets, as well as expanding markets for British goods, were the stepping stones to complete colonialism. The transatlantic slave trade was a brutal and devastating system that ravaged Nigerian societies, disrupted economies, and shattered lives. Through the stories of enslaved Nigerians, we've glimpsed the horrors of the Middle Passage, the brutality of slave labor, and the resilience of the human spirit. Today, Nigeria continues to grapple with the legacy of the slave trade, from poverty and inequality to social injustice and cultural erasure. Yet, despite these challenges, Nigerians remain a resilient and hopeful people, determined to rebuild their communities, reclaim their heritage, and forge a brighter future. We must remember our past, honor our ancestors, and work towards a future where all people are treated with dignity and respect. Don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel for more videos on Nigerian history, culture, and heritage.